This video is created for informational purposes only. Everyone mentioned is treated with respect, and no harm or disrespect is intended. Viewer discretion is advised. On August 13, 2018, Frederick, Colorado became the center of a case that would dominate headlines for months. Shanann Watts, 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant, was reported missing along with her two daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. Within days, the investigation would focus on one person. Within weeks, there would be a confession. And by November of that year, Chris Watts would plead guilty to multiple counts of murder, accepting life in prison without parole. The question people still ask isn't what happened, we know what happened. The question is why. And in 2025, Watts is still trying to answer that from prison. Let's start with who they were. Shanann Catherine Watts was born in New Jersey, grew up in North Carolina, and built a life that revolved around family. She worked in marketing for a health and wellness company, frequently posting videos about the products she believed in and the life she was building. Her social media presence wasn't unusual for 2018. It was typical of many young mothers, documenting moments, celebrating milestones, sharing the highs, and occasionally the struggles of raising two small children while working from home. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. She was starting to read, loved school, and had her mother's expressive face. In videos, you can hear her voice, bright and curious. Celeste Renee Watts, called Cece by everyone who knew her, was 3. She was quieter than her sister, often described as cuddly and sweet. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with a boy they'd already named Nico. Chris Watts was 33. He worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, a job that required early mornings and long hours at oil and gas sites outside Frederick. Co-workers described him as quiet, polite, and unremarkable. He didn't stand out. He didn't cause problems. The family lived in a 4-bedroom home in a subdivision called Saratoga Trails. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors, where kids played outside, where life felt safe. On the surface, everything looked fine. Shanann posted about date nights, family trips, the girls' milestones. Chris appeared in photos and videos, smiling beside his wife and daughters. But the surface wasn't the whole story. By the summer of 2018, the marriage was strained. Shanann had taken the girls to North Carolina for 6 weeks to visit family. Chris stayed in Colorado, working. During that time, according to later testimony and evidence, he began an affair with a co-worker named Nichol Kessinger. When Shanann returned to Colorado in mid-August, she knew something was wrong. Text messages between her and friends reveal her concern. She told one friend that Chris had been distant, that he'd changed, that she didn't know how to fix it. On August 10th, Shanann sent a text to one of her friends. She said they'd had an emotional conversation, that Chris had cried, but that things still didn't feel right. 2 days later, in the early morning hours of August 13th, a neighbor's security camera captured Chris Watts' truck backing into the driveway of their home at 5:27 a.m. By the time that truck pulled away 13 minutes later, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and their unborn brother were gone. Shanann had flown home late on the night of August 12th, returning from a work trip to Arizona. A friend dropped her off at the house just before 2 a.m. on the 13th. Security footage shows Shanann walking to the front door with her suitcase, her friend waiting to make sure she got inside safely. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Later that morning, around noon, another one of Shanann's friends arrived at the house for a scheduled appointment. Shanann wasn't answering texts or calls, which was unusual. The friend, named Nicole Atkinson, grew worried. She went to the house and knocked. No answer. Nicole could see Shanann's car in the garage. The house was locked. Something felt wrong. She called the Frederick Police Department. At 1:40 p.m., an officer arrived at the Watts home. Nicole explained that Shanann was pregnant, had a doctor's appointment that day, and wasn't responding. She emphasized that this wasn't like Shanann at all. The officer walked through the house with Nicole. Shanann's phone was there. Her medication was there. Her shoes and purse were inside. But Shanann and the girls were nowhere to be found. While they were at the house, Chris Watts arrived home from work. The officer's body camera captured the entire interaction, and that footage would later be analyzed frame by frame. Chris appeared calm. He said he didn't know where his wife and daughters were. He said Shanann had come home late from her trip, and when he left for work that morning around 5:15, everyone was still asleep. He said she must have taken the girls somewhere, maybe to a friend's house. But her car was in the garage, her phone was on the kitchen counter, and according to Chris, she'd left without her purse or medication. The officer asked Chris to call Shanann's phone. He did. It rang inside the house. The officer asked if there were any problems in the marriage. Chris said no, everything was fine, though he admitted they'd had an emotional conversation the night before. Nichol, standing nearby, didn't believe him. She later told investigators that his demeanor felt off, that he wasn't acting like a man whose pregnant wife and children were missing. By that evening, the Frederick Police Department had opened a missing persons investigation. Chris Watts gave his first television interview, standing outside the house pleading for Shanann and the girls to come home. He said he wanted them back. He said he missed them. But behind the scenes, investigators were already looking closely at him. The case moved quickly. Within hours of the initial report, local law enforcement contacted the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI. This wasn't being treated as a simple missing persons case. The circumstances were too suspicious. Investigators learned that Chris Watts had been having an affair. Phone records showed frequent communication between him and Nichol Kessinger in the weeks leading up to Shanann's disappearance. On August 8th, just 5 days before Shanann vanished, Chris had told Kessinger that his divorce was nearly finalized. It wasn't. Shanann had no idea he wanted a divorce. Surveillance footage became crucial. The neighbor's security camera, positioned across the street from the Watts home, had a clear view of the driveway. Investigators reviewed the footage from the early morning of August 13th. At 5:27 a.m., Chris Watts's truck backed into the driveway, an unusual position since he typically pulled in forward. The truck was there for 13 minutes. At 5:40 a.m., it pulled away. No one else was seen leaving the house that morning. Not Shanann, not the girls, no one. GPS data from Chris's work truck showed that after leaving the house, he drove to a remote oil field site owned by Anadarko, a location called Cervi. He spent several hours there before heading to other work sites. On August 14th, investigators obtained a search warrant for the Watts home. They found Shanann's wedding ring on the nightstand. They found her phone. Everything suggested she'd never left. Meanwhile, Chris agreed to take a polygraph test. He failed, badly. After the test, an investigator sat down with Chris and told him directly that he wasn't being truthful. The investigator said they knew Shanann and the girls hadn't left the house. He asked Chris to tell the truth. Chris started to cry. Then he started talking. He admitted that he'd been having an affair. He admitted that he and Shanann had gotten into an argument early on the morning of August 13th. And then he said something that would briefly shift the direction of the investigation. He claimed that he'd told Shanann he wanted a separation, and that in response Shanann had strangled their daughters. According to Chris in this version, he walked in and saw Bella and Celeste dead on their beds, with Shanann nearby. He said he went into a rage and strangled Shanann in response. He admitted to loading all 3 bodies into his truck and driving to the Cervi site. He said he buried Shanann in a shallow grave and put the girls' bodies into oil tanks. Investigators knew immediately that parts of this story didn't add up, but now they had a location. On August 15th, law enforcement, along with FBI agents, went to the Cervi site. It was a desolate area, nothing around but oil equipment and dirt roads. They found Shanann's body in a shallow grave covered with dirt and a sheet. Nearby were 2 oil tanks. Inside those tanks, submerged in crude oil, were the bodies of Bella and Celeste. The autopsies would later confirm what investigators suspected. Chris Watts had lied again. Shanann had been manually strangled. So had both girls. All 3 had died from asphyxiation. And based on evidence found at the scene and on the bodies, Bella and Celeste had not been killed at home. They'd been alive when they were driven to that oil field, which meant Chris Watts had looked at his daughters, likely terrified and confused, and murdered them at that site. On August 15, 2018, Chris Watts was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of murdering a child under 12, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. He was held without bond. For weeks, Chris Watts stayed quiet. His attorneys advised him not to speak. The evidence against him was overwhelming: security footage, GPS data, phone records, his own failed polygraph, and the location of the bodies, which only he could have known. But in February 2019, after he'd already pleaded guilty, Chris Watts agreed to sit down with investigators for another interview. This time, he told a different story. He admitted that everything he'd said before about Shanann killing the girls was a lie. He admitted that he alone had killed all 3 of them. According to this confession, Chris had told Shanann in the early morning hours of August 13th that he wanted a separation. An argument followed. He claimed that at some point he strangled Shanann on their bed while the girls were still asleep. He said he then loaded Shanann's body into his truck. Bella and Celeste woke up. They came downstairs. He told them that their mother wasn't feeling well and that they were going to go for a drive. He loaded the girls into the truck. Shanann's body was in the back, covered, and according to Chris, Bella asked, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as happened to Cece?" That statement, if true, would suggest that Bella had seen something, that she knew something terrible had happened. Chris drove for 45 minutes to the survey site. He unloaded Shanann's body first and buried her in a shallow grave. Then he smothered Bella and Celeste, one at a time, and placed their bodies into oil tanks filled with crude oil. He said Cece didn't fight, but Bella did. She fought back as her father killed her. He then went to work. He attended meetings, he spoke to co-workers, and when Shanann's friend called him to ask where she was, he played the part of a concerned husband. This confession, recorded and later released to the public, filled in many of the blanks. But it also raised more questions. Why would a father do this? What was going through his mind? Chris Watts offered explanations that felt hollow. He said he wanted a fresh start. He said he didn't want to go through a custody battle. He said he didn't want to pay child support. He said he wanted to be with Nichol Kessinger without the complications of a family. None of it made sense. Not to investigators, not to the public, not to Shanann's family. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts appeared in court. He pleaded guilty to all charges, 9 counts in total, including 3 counts of first-degree murder. In exchange for the guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. On November 19, 2018, he was sentenced. 3 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, 2 additional consecutive life sentences for the murders of Bella and Celeste as children under 12, and additional years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy and tampering with the bodies. 5 life sentences. No possibility of parole. No chance of release. Chris Watts would spend the rest of his life in prison. Shanann's family gave victim impact statements. Her father, Frank Razuchek, spoke directly to Chris. He said, "I trusted you to take care of them. I trusted you." Shanann's mother, Sandra Razuchek, said she forgave Chris, but not because he deserved it, because she needed peace. And then Chris Watts was taken away. That sentencing in November 2018 should have been the end of the public story. Chris Watts would disappear into the prison system. The world would move on. Shanann's family would try to rebuild their lives in private. But that's not what happened, because Chris Watts kept talking. He kept writing. And over the years, pieces of his prison life began to leak out, through letters, through phone calls, through reports from people who'd had contact with him. And in 2025, more of that information has become public than ever before. So what does life in prison actually look like for Chris Watts? Where is he? What does he do all day? Who does he talk to? And what is he saying? Let's talk about where he is right now. After his sentencing in Colorado, Chris Watts was initially housed at the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. In December 2018, he was transferred out of state for safety reasons. Keeping him in Colorado posed risks, both from other inmates and from the intense public attention. He was moved to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility that houses some of the state's most dangerous offenders. Waupun is not a pleasant place. It's old, built in 1851, and has a reputation for being one of the toughest prisons in the Wisconsin system. Overcrowding is a constant issue. Violence is not uncommon, and for someone like Chris Watts, whose crimes involve children, every day is a potential threat. Inmates who harm children are at the bottom of the prison hierarchy. Other prisoners target them. Guards sometimes look the other way. It's a reality that Chris Watts has had to navigate since the moment he arrived. Initially, Watts was placed in protective custody. That's a separate unit where inmates who are at high risk of being attacked are housed. It's safer, but it's also more restrictive. Less freedom, less interaction, more isolation. But over time, according to reports and letters that have surfaced, Chris Watts has been moved into the general population at times. That's significant. It means he's interacting with other inmates, eating in common areas, working prison jobs. And that's raised eyebrows, because most people assume someone like Chris Watts would stay in protective custody permanently. So what does his daily routine look like? According to information from people who have corresponded with him, Chris Watts wakes up early, usually around 5 a.m. He works in the prison kitchen, a job that keeps him busy and, according to him, gives him purpose. He's been described by people who've received letters from him as polite, soft-spoken, and eager to present himself as someone who's changed. He participates in religious services. He reads the Bible. He's told multiple people that he's found God and that he's a different person now. But here's where it gets complicated. Because prison records obtained through public records requests tell a slightly different story. Chris Watts has not been a model inmate. In 2019, just months after arriving at Dodge Correctional, Chris Watts received his first conduct violation. The details weren't made public at the time, but recent reporting has revealed that he was cited for having photos of Shanann and the girls in his cell. Prison rules typically prohibit inmates convicted of killing someone from possessing photos of their victims. The reasoning is that it can be seen as a trophy or a way of reliving the crime. For Chris, however, he claimed the photos were a way of remembering his family, of staying connected to who they were. The prison didn't see it that way. The photos were confiscated, and he received a disciplinary write-up. In 2020, there was another incident. Chris Watts was found to be in possession of letters and photographs sent by women who'd been writing to him. This in itself isn't unusual. Inmates who commit high-profile crimes often receive mail from strangers, some sympathetic, some curious, some disturbed. But the volume of correspondence Chris was receiving became an issue. He was reportedly getting dozens of letters a week. Some included money, some included explicit photos, and prison officials grew concerned about the nature of these relationships. There's a term for this: hybristophilia. It's an attraction to people who've committed serious crimes. And Chris Watts, despite being a convicted family annihilator, has no shortage of women who write to him, send him money and express affection. It's unsettling, but it's also a reality of high-profile cases. Another violation came in 2021. According to records, Chris was cited for communicating with an unauthorized person outside the prison. The details are vague, but it's believed this involved a woman he'd been corresponding with who violated prison protocol, possibly by attempting to visit under false pretenses. The most significant incident, however, reportedly occurred in late 2023. Multiple tabloid outlets reported that Chris Watts had been attacked by another inmate. The reports varied. Some claimed he was beaten badly. Others said it was a minor altercation. Prison officials have not confirmed the details of this incident. Requests for records have been either denied or heavily redacted. But people who have been in contact with Chris around that time say he referenced being in a situation that required him to be moved temporarily. Whether or not a serious attack occurred, the reports highlight the reality that Chris Watts is not safe in general population. His crimes make him a target. And despite whatever routines or stability he's managed to create, that threat is constant. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Chris Watts' life in prison isn't the violations or the attacks, it's what he's been writing. Before we get into those letters, if you want to stay updated on cases like this, stories that go beyond the headlines and look at what happens after the cameras turn off, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you verified information, not speculation, and every bit of support helps us keep going. All right, let's talk about what Chris Watts has been saying from behind bars. Chris Watts has been writing a lot. Since his incarceration, he's maintained correspondence with multiple people, some who knew him before his arrest, others who reached out after. These letters have occasionally made their way into the hands of journalists, and excerpts have been published in various outlets over the years. In 2019, a letter surfaced in which Chris described his daily life in prison. He wrote about his job in the kitchen, his participation in Bible study, and his relationships with other inmates. He emphasized that he was trying to be a better person, that he was working on himself. He also expressed regret, not in the way you might expect. His letters often read as more focused on how hard his life is now, rather than on what he took from Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. One line from a 2019 letter, "I pray every day that I can be the man I should have been." It's a sentiment that feels incomplete, because he had the chance to be that man. He chose not to be. In 2020, more letters emerged. In these, Chris talked about his faith. He claimed he'd been baptized in prison and that he'd given his life to Christ. He wrote about reading scripture, about finding peace, about believing that God had forgiven him. For many people, this was infuriating. The idea that Chris Watts could find peace while Shanann's family would never have peace felt obscene. But Chris continued writing, and in some letters, he went further. He began to reframe his story. In one letter from 2021, Chris wrote about the morning of August 13, 2018. He described the argument with Shanann. He described the moment he made the decision to kill her. And then he wrote this: "I don't know who I was that day, it wasn't me. I know that sounds like an excuse, but I mean it. I wasn't myself." This is a common theme in his letters, the idea that the person who committed those murders was somehow separate from who he is now, that he's changed, that he's different. But the facts don't change. The little girls in those oil tanks don't come back because he found religion. In 2022, Chris began writing to a woman named Dylan Tallman, who runs a YouTube channel focused on true crime. The correspondence was later made public with Tallman's permission. In those letters, Chris opened up more than he had before. He talked about his childhood. He talked about his relationship with his mother, Cindy Watts, who has publicly defended him and, disturbingly, criticized Shanann even after her death. He talked about feeling like he'd never been able to express himself, that he'd always just gone along with what others wanted. At one point he wrote, "I spent my whole life being who people wanted me to be. I never stood up for myself, I never said no, and I think that's part of why I snapped." Again, it reads like an attempt to explain the unexplainable, and again it falls short. Because plenty of people feel trapped in their marriages, plenty of people have affairs, plenty of people get divorced, they don't murder their entire family. In 2024, new letters surfaced. These were sent to a woman Chris had been corresponding with regularly. The letters were more personal, more reflective. And in one of them, Chris wrote something that caught attention. He claimed that on the morning of August 13th, after he'd killed Shanann but before he killed the girls, he had a moment where he thought about stopping. He wrote that Bella had looked at him in the truck and said, "Daddy, what's wrong?" And according to this letter, he'd considered turning around, he'd considered calling the police. He'd considered confessing right then, but he didn't. He kept driving. Whether or not this moment actually happened, we'll never know. Chris Watts has told multiple versions of the events of that morning, but if it's true, it makes the crime even more horrific, because it means he had a chance to stop, and he chose not to. The letters also reveal that Chris is still in contact with his mother and father. His mother, Cindy, has been a controversial figure. She's given interviews where she's suggested that Shanann was responsible for the breakdown of the marriage. She's blamed Shanann for keeping the girls away from the Watts family. She's even said she believes Chris's initial claim that Shanann killed the girls. None of that is supported by evidence, but Cindy Watts has remained steadfast in defending her son, and that dynamic appears in Chris's letters. He writes about talking to his mom on the phone, about her sending him money, about her being one of the few people who still supports him. Shanann's family, meanwhile, has had to watch all of this unfold publicly. They've had to see Chris's face on television, read his letters in news articles, and hear him talk about redemption while they visit graves. In 2025, the most recent letters to be made public show Chris continuing the same themes: faith, regret, and change. But there's something else that started to appear: a tone of frustration. In one recent letter, Chris wrote about how difficult it is to live with what he's done. He wrote about nightmares, about waking up in the middle of the night, and for just a second, forgetting where he is. And then remembering. He wrote, "I'll never be free. Not really. Even if I walked out of here tomorrow, I'd still be in a prison of my own making." It's the closest he's come to acknowledging that no amount of faith or letters or self-improvement will undo what he did. But even in that acknowledgement, there's a focus on his own suffering, not theirs. One of the stranger aspects of Chris Watts's prison life is the attention he receives from women on the outside. As mentioned earlier, he gets dozens of letters a week. Some are from women who believe he's innocent, despite his guilty plea and confession. Others are from women who acknowledge what he did, but claim to see good in him anyway. Some of these women send money to his commissary account, some send photos, some have tried to visit him in prison. There's been reporting that Chris had a relationship with a woman who he was corresponding with regularly in 2020 and 2021. The relationship was apparently romantic in nature, conducted entirely through letters and phone calls. The woman reportedly believed Chris had changed and that he deserved a second chance. That relationship eventually ended, though the details aren't public. But it wasn't the only one. Chris has maintained multiple ongoing correspondences with women who, for reasons that are hard to understand, are drawn to him. Psychologists who study this phenomenon point to several factors. Some women are attracted to the idea of fixing someone, others are drawn to the notoriety, and some genuinely believe they can see a side of the person that others can't. For Chris Watts, these relationships provide a connection to the outside world. They also allow him to maintain some sense of control over his narrative. In letters, he can be whoever he wants to be. He can present himself as remorseful, as changed, as misunderstood. And there will always be people willing to believe it. While Chris Watts writes letters and corresponds with strangers, Shanann's family has been living with the aftermath. Frank and Sandra Ruchek, Shanann's parents, have largely stayed out of the public eye. They gave their victim impact statements at sentencing and have occasionally spoken to media, but for the most part, they've tried to grieve privately. Shannon's brother, Frankie Razuchek, has been more vocal. He's spoken about the pain of losing his sister and nieces. He's talked about how difficult it is to see Chris's face in the media, to hear him talk about redemption, to watch people online debate the case as if it's entertainment. In 2020, Frankie posted on social media about the letters Chris had been writing. He said it was disgusting that Chris was trying to present himself as a changed man. He said that no amount of Bible study or prison baptisms would bring Shanann, Bella, and Celeste back. The Razuchek family has also had to contend with online harassment. There are people on the internet, thankfully a small minority, who have accused Shanann of being a bad mother, a manipulative wife, or somehow responsible for what happened. These claims are baseless and cruel, but they exist in corners of the internet where conspiracy theories thrive. Shanann's family has asked repeatedly for privacy. They've asked for people to remember Shanann, Bella, and Celeste as they were, loving, vibrant, full of life. Not as characters in a true crime story, but in cases like this, that's hard to control. In 2021, the Netflix documentary American Murder: The Family Next Door brought the case back into the spotlight. The documentary used social media posts, body camera footage, and text messages to tell the story. It was watched by millions. For Shanann's family, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept Shanann's memory alive. On the other, it reopened wounds and brought a new wave of attention. The Razuchek family has also had to navigate legal matters. In 2019, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Chris Watts. He was ordered to pay $6 million in damages. He has no assets and is unlikely to ever pay a cent. But the judgment was symbolic. In 2020, they settled a separate lawsuit with Anadarko Petroleum. the company Chris worked for. The settlement amount was not disclosed, but it reportedly provided some financial stability for Shanann's parents as they tried to move forward. But money doesn't replace people. And for Frank and Sandra Zuchek, every birthday, every holiday, every August 13th is a reminder of what was taken. Shanann's mother has said in interviews that she forgives Chris, not because he deserves it, but because holding on to hate was destroying her. That kind of grace is extraordinary, and it's something Chris Watts hasn't earned. If this case affects you the way it affects so many of us, take a second and subscribe. We're covering cases with respect and depth, and we're not here to sensationalize or exploit. We're here to remember the people who were lost and to understand what justice looks like when it's served. Let's keep going. So what does life in prison without parole actually mean for Chris Watts? It means he will wake up in a cell every day for the rest of his life. He will eat meals prepared by the prison. He will work a job assigned to him. He will follow a schedule dictated by guards. He will never make a decision for himself again. It means he will never go to a restaurant, never drive a car, never feel grass under his feet unless it's in a prison yard, never hold someone he loves, never see a sunrise outside of a narrow window with bars. For some people, that feels like justice. For others, it doesn't feel like enough. Shanann's father, Frank Razuchek, said in his victim impact statement that he'd wanted the death penalty. He said he wanted Chris to feel what Shanann felt, what Bella felt, what Cece felt. But the family ultimately agreed to the plea deal because they didn't want to go through a trial. They didn't want to sit in a courtroom and hear every detail. Even now, 7 years later, there are questions people still ask. Why did he do it? That's the big one. And the truth is, we'll probably never have a satisfying answer. Chris has given multiple explanations: financial stress, the affair, wanting a fresh start, feeling trapped. But none of those reasons justify what he did. And none of them really explain it. Some psychologists who've analyzed the case suggest that Chris Watts is a family annihilator, a specific type of killer who murders their spouse and children, usually to escape a situation they can't cope with. It's not common, but it's not unheard of. Other experts have pointed to his personality, described by people who knew him as passive, avoidant, and conflict-averse. They suggest that Chris spent his entire life avoiding confrontation, never standing up for himself, always going along with what others wanted. And when he finally wanted something different, when he finally felt desire for someone else and a life that didn't include his family, he didn't know how to handle it like an adult. So instead of having a difficult conversation, instead of filing for divorce, instead of being honest with Shanann about the affair and his feelings, he chose the most extreme solution possible. He erased them. But that analysis, while it may explain the psychology, doesn't make it any easier to understand. Because millions of people feel trapped in their lives. Millions of people have affairs. Millions of people go through divorces. They don't kill their families. The Chris Watts case has become one of the most discussed true crime cases online. There are entire forums dedicated to analyzing every detail, YouTube channels that have made hundreds of videos about the case, Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members dissecting his words, his body language, his letters. Some of this attention comes from a genuine place, people trying to understand how something like this happens, trying to make sense of senseless violence. But some of it crosses a line. There are people who have romanticized Chris Watts, women who write to him, who defend him, who claim he was a victim of circumstance or a manipulative wife. There are conspiracy theories that suggest Shanann was abusive, that she was controlling, that she somehow pushed Chris to this point. None of that is supported by evidence. And even if Shanann had been difficult, which by all accounts she wasn't, that doesn't justify murder. Nothing justifies murder. Shanann's family has had to watch this online obsession unfold. They've had to see people pick apart Shanann's social media posts, criticize her parenting, question her motives. They've had to see strangers defend the man who killed their daughter and granddaughters. Frankie Razuchek has spoken about this. He said that the online attention has made the grieving process even harder because it's not just about mourning Shanann, Bella, and Celeste anymore. It's about defending them against people who never knew them. And that shouldn't be necessary. But in the age of true crime as entertainment, It's become part of the reality for families like the Zucheks. There's also been attention on Nichol Kessinger, the woman Chris was having an affair with. After the case became public, Nichol cooperated with investigators. She gave interviews. She turned over her phone. And then she disappeared from public view. She's reportedly changed her name and moved to an undisclosed location. People online have speculated about her involvement, with some suggesting she knew more than she let on. But investigators cleared her. There's no evidence she had any knowledge of what Chris was planning or what he'd done. Still, her life was destroyed by association. And while that's tragic in its own way, it's important to remember who the real victims are. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, Nico. Not Chris, not Nichol, not anyone else. So where does the story go from here? For Chris Watts, the answer is simple. He stays in prison, he serves his time, and eventually, decades from now, he'll die there. There won't be appeals, there won't be parole hearings. There won't be a moment where he gets to argue for his freedom. That's what life without parole means. He'll continue writing letters, probably. He'll continue talking to whoever is willing to listen. He'll continue trying to shape his narrative, to convince people that he's changed, that he's remorseful, that he's not the monster everyone thinks he is. But letters don't undo what he did. As for the rest of us, the question is what we take from this case. It's easy to get lost in the details, in the timelines, in the letters, in the theories. But at the end of the day, this isn't a puzzle to solve. It's not a mystery. We know what happened. We know who did it. We know why as much as we'll ever know. What we're left with is a reminder that people aren't always who they seem, that danger doesn't always look dangerous, that a man who seems quiet and polite and unremarkable can be capable of unthinkable violence, and that the people who suffer most are the ones who trusted him. Before we close, let's take a moment to remember who this story is really about. Shanann Catherine Watts, born January 10, 1984. A daughter, a sister, a friend. A woman who loved her children more than anything, who worked hard to provide for her family, who posted videos because she was proud of her life, not because she was hiding something, who was 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy she and Chris had already named Nico. She was 34 years old when she died. Bella Marie Watts, 4 years old, starting to read, loved school, had her mother's smile, fought back when her father tried to kill her, asked a question no 4-year-old should ever have to ask. Celeste Renee Watts, 3 years old, quieter than her sister, loved being held, trusted her father completely, even as he took her life. Nico Lee Watts, never born, never got to meet his family, never got to take a breath. Those are the names that matter. If this case has stayed with you, if it's made you think about the people in your own life that you love and want to protect, take a moment and leave a comment. Tell us what struck you most. Tell us what you'll remember about Shanann and her daughters. Let's make this comment section a place where they're honored, not where the focus stays on him. And if you want more coverage like this, respectful, thorough, focused on the victims, go ahead and subscribe. We're here to tell these stories the right way. Thank you for watching. Remember Shanann, remember Bella, remember Celeste, remember Nico. They deserved so much more.